Everyone, welcome to another book review Wednesday, and today I'm going to be diving into I believe it is 1847 book titled Jane Eyre. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. I could be wrong on that. And this was written by Charlotte Bronte. Bronte, but I'm not sure if that's exactly how you pronounce her last name. But regardless, this is considered to be one of the classics of this era, and I think it is definitely safe to say why that is, and uh, is actually probably my favorite out of all of the other 1800s works that were largely dominated by women, surprisingly. I mean, this was an era where women were really at the forefront within writing, and in particular in England. So it is rather interesting to see these sort of tales being told and sort of through a woman's perspective, at least during this period. So uh, basically, this book follows the journey of none other than the main character and title of the story, Jane Eyre. I believe that's how you pronounce it. I could be wrong again. But basically, you sort of see how she starts off as a child. She is orphaned by her aunt, and she eventually goes through various um, detours throughout the story. Like she'll be at one location at one point and another location in another. I don't really want to give away as to where she kind of ends up because that's sort of spoiling the sort of premise that really dominates the narrative and really puts forward the direction of the story. So, uh, but basically, all you, I think, have to really understand as far as plotting is concerned is that she ultimately kind of goes from place to place, and this allows for her character to sort of develop. And eventually, she ends up being a governess for this man named Mr. Rochester, and eventually she ends up falling in love with him, but due to a variety of circumstances that end up occurring, she is sort of um, forced to separate herself eventually from him, um, and you'll sort of see how that unfolds and what ends up really happening if you choose to read the story. And you sort of see her after that going through various detours. So she sort of, again, abandons the location, at least where she was really serving Mr. Rochester as a governess. And again, a lot of other things end up occurring that sort of encompass the plot. So again, I don't really want to spoil this for anybody, but that's sort of the direction that oftentimes these stories take. But I think the way in which uh, Jane Eyre, excuse me, uh, is told is actually very effective because it doesn't try to have a sort of a conflict more centered around characters or like these really kind of convenient misinterpretations. More so, it relies on actual circumstances that end up happening that result in a character into her being sort of separated or moved from one place to another. So, again, I think that's something that's really important to note when it comes to this particular work because a lot of these stories like to rely on misinformation and people really not interpreting one another correctly, and hence we get this whole drama of a plot. But here it's played out, I think, more relatively realistic uh, to the extent that it, again, is more relying on circumstance rather than um, relying on some kind of misinterpretation between various characters. Now, Jane, the character herself, is very determined, she's very intelligent, and she also has a certain amount of rebelliousness to her. And I think this, in and of itself, I think was something that I sort of could identify with. She's kind of the character who, doesn't try to, you know, bend over for people, especially those who really sort of kind of end up abusing their power. Um, and, again, despite the fact that she's not as pretty, at least the way in which they describe her within the story, they kind of give off a sense of her being sort of plain. She still has just a huge amount of, I think, personality, and that um, just that really allows you to kind of get, I think, behind the character. And I think a lot of people too kind of suffer from that mentality of feeling that there's nothing truly special about them, in the sense that they initially appear fairly plain, but when you really dive in deeper into, kind of who they are, you sort of see the amount of interesting traits that they have, and the way in which the novel sort of, or book, excuse me, sort of presents this, I think ultimately works to its advantage. And uh, the great thing too about the way in which they tell this story is that despite Jane having to suffer various obstacles and going through things and making various decisions, she still has that sort of will to keep going and, sort of take things as they come. And eventually, she ends up finding her sort of peace and happiness. And I think it really works as far as the story is concerned, when sort of dealing with this kind of subject matter. And you sort of see too how strict the times were and how people were really uppity about various things, and how sort of Jane sort of goes against that kind of conventional thinking. Um, and overall, the way in which the story is presented, I think, worked at least um, better than a lot of other stories that I've read that try to um, comment on various things that were sort of important during the time, like class. And although class does play a role within the story, it's not necessarily a complete um, definition, so to speak, of the circumstances. There's still other things that are sort of brought to light, and I think this gives the book a little bit of a more broader, I guess you could say, a look into the time period, as opposed to really addressing class all too much or really focusing on it, because a lot of these stories try to really wedge that point in, and that's why a lot of the times the couples who end up liking each other don't end up getting married because of their class difference. And although, again, it is emphasized that Jane is of a lower class than Mr. Rochester, it's, again, not really the most definitive of reasons as to what ultimately leads to them sort of being separated. So, again, there is a lot of things that it's trying to kind of bring about. And the way I think in which it brings about them, I think ultimately really does work, and really sets it apart. And you really do see how, um, Jane kind of looks beyond, um, wealth and things of that nature, and really does try to be of a more, I guess you could say, humble of characters. So I think that's also something that really works to this story's advantage as well, and all the more reason why I really kind of enjoy and gravitate towards it. But I think that's really ultimately, though, all I can say about the story without really giving too much away. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Expect a delay for Thursday and Friday's video. They will be uploaded, but they will be uploaded not until Saturday, because I'm not going to be here on Thursday and Friday. So expect a delay for that. But until then, everybody,